Hey guys, this is Seth with week number 4 of class lecture. Here, let me adjust my computer here. I'm coming at you from my apartment today because it is snowed in. But online classes, no snow days. So we're going to be going over the PowerPoint number 4 on toddlers. And since you can't see what I'm looking at, I don't have the board behind me today. I'm going to just say whenever I transition slides. So, first slide here is obviously title slide. Let's go forth into the next slide. So the objectives for this session are to talk about the developmental tasks and psychosocial crises of the toddler age. And we're going to kind of follow a similar format that we did for infancy, and as we're going to follow for the rest of the class. We're going to review Piaget's preoperational stage, and we're also going to talk about language development briefly. Now, the language development slides are very rudimentary. Your book does a whole lot better job of explaining language development, so I would highly refer you to those in your study for the midterm. Okay, you are going to have to answer some questions on basic language development. All right, so let's get started. Next slide. So Hattinghurst, basically the breakdown of his stages for toddlerhood are the elaboration of locomotion. In infancy, the child could be largely immobile for the first several months of their life and then begin to crawl and move and begin to kind of manipulate their world. Well, in the toddler age, this is when they really begin to come into their own as little manipulators, little world changers. They get to really kind of learn their fine motor skills at this age. Okay, language development continues, and we'll again talk about that in just a little bit. Fantasy play really comes into its own at this age, and that is a function, if you recall from last week, of the transition between sensory motor stage and Piaget's stages of cognitive development and the preoperational stage, and the transition there typically occurring with language development. And so with the onset of language comes the ability to represent the world in symbols and forms. And so the fantasy play and the imaginative play, which is so efficient for understanding and conceptualizing the world, kind of begins to take off. And then the increase of their ability to control themselves, from their potty training to cleaning up after themselves to dressing themselves rudimentarily, things like that. Okay, so they begin to kind of control not only the world around them, but themselves as well. So and we'll see in Erikson's stage that this is reflected in his sense of autonomy. But we'll get into that. Next slide. Again, we're going to be touching on Erikson's stage of autonomy versus shame and doubt. All right. Now, next slide. The big question here is for the child is, can I do it? They've been seeing these huge, figures in their world and relying upon them and are dependent upon them in infancy. And now that they have the ability to control their world and to control, some level of, dressing themselves, feeding themselves, things like that, there comes a sense of control. All right. And so can I do it? Can I do it like the big people do? And so the next slide is what Erikson, in his book Identity, Youth, and Crisis, on page, I forget what it is. I think it's page 60 something. No, 80 something. Yes, 110. 60 something, right? Page 110 of that book, he says that it is necessary for a parent basically to exert a level of control upon the child during this time, kind of to protect them from themselves. You know, they're little agents. They're little movers and changers of the world around them. And so the parent has to kind of regulate that behavior. So he says, firmness must protect him against the potential anarchy of his yet untrained sense of discrimination, his inability to hold on and let go with discretion. As his environment encourages him to, quote, stand on his own feet, it must protect him against meaningless and arbitrary experiences of shame and early doubt. So what is that saying? So while a parent does have the responsibility of protecting the child and teaching them and helping them kind of grow into little people, there is a huge risk there of a parent going too far, of shaming the child, of, you know, saying, oh, you did that, you know, shame on you, wag of the finger, and you know, how could you make me have to do this? You know, shame on you. And that shame can eventually turn into a level of doubt in the child, you know, in their ability to do things and their ability to control the world around them. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit more depth here in a second. Next slide. So the seven characteristics that we've talked about in terms of Erikson's stages, again, central processes being the first, is imitation. So can I do it like the big people do it? Can I dress myself? Can I feed myself? Can I, you know, make the world change like the big people do? And so they imitate the parent. They do what the parent does a lot of times. If you see, for instance, a father, you know, hammering a nail, well, the child will hammer, you know, a nail as well. Or a little girl will, or a little boy will be in the kitchen with mommy, you know, kind of play cooking as she cooks dinner, something like that. So imitation is the central process here, and so the radius of significant relations in which that central process takes root is parents. So we remember last week we talked about how in infancy the radius of central or significant relations is the mother. Well, now it's extended to the father, maybe a sibling, maybe, you know, maybe grandparents, caretakers, you know, who is in the world that I can imitate, that I look up to, that takes care of me, that I can model myself after. So the adaptive ego quality of this stage, the positive thing that comes out of this is will, determination, motivation, drive, you know, a desire to accomplish, to perform, will. But unfortunately, the core pathology that comes from the shame and doubt that is possible from this stage, again, if a parent shames a child too much or they develop a sense of doubt in their ability to perform or do things for themselves, is compulsivity. And why would it be compulsivity, though? So think about this. Compulsion is essentially a desire to control. It comes out of a fear of a lack of control. So a child will learn to be obsessive and compulsive over their world in order to avoid that sense of shame and doubt, to protect themselves really from feeling incompetent, from feeling powerless. They will become overly organized. They will become super focused on being perfect. And this is very reflective of Erikson's Freudian roots. So at this age, we're talking more about anal fixations. And we remember from the first week or the second week's lecture that people who fixate in the anal stage typically are either anal retentive or anal expulsive. Anal retentive being more of the obsessive compulsive aspect, and the perfectionistic, the neat, tidy, whereas the anal expulsive is more of the messy and unregulated type. And so the child who feels shame and doubt in Erikson's stage here kind of develops that desire to be more anal retentive. Let's move on to principle of social order here. So what the concept of law and order mean? During this stage, children think in terms of black and white, right and wrong, good and evil. Well, I mean, the theological lesson down below is good and evil. And if they perform an action and they are praised for it, so they put away their toys. I did something good. Mommy is clapping for me. Or Daddy says thank you. Or I did something right by imitating them. That gives them a sense that what they did was good. Whereas if they are punished or shamed, they experience a sense of what they did was wrong, evil, bad. And there is no real in-between. It's not a gray area. Gray areas typically are able to form more towards the concrete, the latter part of the concrete, and into the formal operation stage. Well, children at this age are preoperational in their thought, so they don't really see that their actions are any different from themselves. If I did something that warrants a punishment, I am bad. It's not the action that was wrong, I am wrong. I am bad. And so that can contribute to that sense of shame and doubt in themselves. Shame is more of a social thing. It requires somebody to be in relation to. I am shamed in a social sense. I doubt myself. Doubt is more of an internal thing. Shame is more of an external thing. The ritualization and ritualism that comes from this concept of law and order, this concept of good and evil, is judiciousness. So that's the ritualization is judiciousness. And judiciousness is a good thing. Remember, ritualization is more of the positive aspect. Ritualism is more of the negative aspect. So judiciousness can be wisdom. It can be a sense of, right judgment, of fairness, things like that. Whereas the legalism, we think, in terms of pharisaical, nature. We think they're too rigid. They're too inflexible in their judgments, and that leads to a lack of fairness almost. There is no middle ground. There is no, gray for these individuals. And so there's a sense of, you are all good or all bad that you might see in some people with personality disorders, such as borderline personalities or narcissism. The theological lesson, and I'm actually a little excited to talk about this because in Interlibrary Loan I got the John Gleason book, Growing Up to God, in which the theological lessons are pulled from in these lectures. And so I'm going to read just a little bit of this to kind of help you understand where John Gleason is coming from in this concept of good versus evil. So he says, with regards to the child may get a feeling that he or she is nothing but a worthless producer of feces. Again, the anal stage here. This is very Freudian in nature. The child may learn that its acts make it what it is, and that there is no real sense of separation between being and doing. Remember? So there's no middle ground. It is, either good or bad, and they internalize those messages saying, my actions are what I am. Okay? He goes on to say, here, theological lessons are taking place. Here, Wayne Oates calls them many an unforgiving legalist has been born. Many a person who learns that one must live by rigid, unattainable rules, and those who infringe upon the rules must be destroyed without mercy. The primary value, then, is law and order, the principle of social order, remember? Here we have the beginning of the unrelenting, quote, guardian of the faith, the one-man army who goes out to do battle with the forces of evil in the world. Those who pass this stage without a sense of autonomy find it easy to look at the world and say, this is good, that is evil, this is right, this is wrong, this is white, this is black. Everything in the world fits into a pigeonhole. This is the birthing place of the fundamentalist mindset. In psychopathology, this is also seen as the breeding ground of the obsessive-compulsive individual, the person who tries to deny the chaos he feels by over-controlling it. So, what does this have to do with theology? What does this have to do with God? What if a child believes that God sees them as good or evil? What if a child thinks that, or even not even just a child, what if somebody who's new to the faith thinks that God is viewing them through a lens of salvation or damnation? A sense of, I'm a sinner, and therefore I'm going to hell, or I'm going to lose my salvation if I, do some minor indiscretion. Imagine the fear that would instill. Imagine the mistrust in oneself and perhaps even God that might instill. And so the good versus evil could suggest, okay, I am good or I am evil, or it could go on to be something even more and say, I see, God is all good, or God is possibly a not all good entity. And then they become extremely fundamentalist, fearful of any minor infraction. And so they become legalistic, pharisaical. Something to think about. So let's go on to the next slide, in which we talk about Piaget's stages of cognitive development. Now, children at this stage, again, they have moved past the sensory motor stage with the onset of language, and they're moved into the preoperational stage. Let's talk about that. Next slide. During the preoperational stage, children tend to be very egocentric. What does that mean? It means that they are very focused on themselves. The world is there to give them what they need, what they want. Mommy, cookie, is something they might say, or pick up, pick me up. It's very them focused, and that will disappear during the preoperational stage, but it will reappear again actually towards adolescence in sort of a reemergence of selfishness and a sense that the world is a stage and they are the primary actor. Classification begins. Now, this actually happens more towards the middle or end of preoperational stage. And so classification, in the beginning stages, in the sensory motor stage, towards the beginning of the preoperational stage, they learn the concept of categories, okay? Things that fly, have wings, and beaks are what? Birds, right? And that's a category. But then there are subcategories, classifications, types of birds. So you have flightless birds. You have birds that swim, uh, flying birds, birds that walk, birds that hop. Um, and those classifications begin in this stage. More later, they kind of learn to break down the categories that they have assumed based upon types. They have what's known as a collective monologue and parallel play. Collective monologue essentially just means that they're talking to no one in a group. They're in a group of kids, and you'll basically just see them jabbering away with nobody, to nobody in particular, but they're having a big old conversation with no one. And that is very similar to parallel play, in which kids will have be in like a group. They'll have toys that could easily be played with together, but they will play with them separately, but they'll be in proximity to one another. And then you have a sense that they confuse reality and appearance. This comes with fantasy play. This comes with a sense of the world being magical. Trees can talk. Animals can understand what you say. Magic is real. Things like that. We'll go on. Next slide. So again, this slide was from the last PowerPoint presentation. So this is kind of a review of the fact that the preoperational stage emerges with the onset of language development as a more efficient way of understanding the world than action or manipulation with one's hands or mouth. And the fact that make-believe or fantasy play kind of plays into that more efficient understanding of the world. Now, preoperational stage also, with the onset of language, means that they can represent their world differently than just feeling something or touch or smell or taste. They can conceptualize for the first time in a linguistic form that other people can relate to. Animistic thinking, we talked about that. Transductive reasoning. Transductive reasoning, A equals B, B equals C, therefore A equals C, right? Okay, so that is a bit more higher order, and that comes more towards the end of the preoperational stage, more towards the concrete operations. In fact, sometimes people take time in the concrete operational stage to get the transductive logic. Next slide. Preoperational stage consists of egocentric thinking. We've already talked about that. Theory of mind does develop in this stage. Like, for instance, I have two 4-year-old nephews, okay, and they're identical twins. One of them, and they're both in the preoperational stage, one of them can say, Joshua is sad, he is crying, or Joshua got hurt, or Caleb got, is happy. They're able to identify that. But they also are very egocentric in that they want all of your attention. They want, to the exclusion of the other. They will cut in line. They will take things. They will not really care if they hurt the other's feelings. They will be able to identify the fact that the other person's feeling is hurt, but they want what they want. It's a selfishness. It's a lack of consideration, really. It's not necessarily a lack of being able to identify emotion. It's a lack of consideration for other people's emotion. Conservation is something that is lacking in this stage. And what conservation is basically the ability to maintain the concept of mass, volume, length, things like that. I believe many of us have seen the example of two glasses, one very tall, the other kind of wide, and if water is poured into the one glass, and the two glasses are the same volume, And if water's poured into the taller glass and then poured into, the smaller bowl, the child will think that there's less water in the bowl because it looks smaller. Whereas height is deemed a measure of amount, when in actuality it's the same amount of water present. I think your book does a pretty good job of describing conservation. Irreversibility is the inability to say, for instance, it's kind of an extension of conservation inability. So, like, if I had a piece of putty and I roll it into a long worm, they don't understand the concept that, okay, it can be, broken apart and then put back together into the ball of putty. It's going to be broken, period. And are kind of surprised at times whenever somebody does take the pieces of putty and pushes them back together and then makes another snake, whatever. And then it's very rigid thinking. Again, it sort of goes along the lines of good versus evil, light versus dark, no gray in their world. So they think in terms of dichotomies. Next slide. So in this comic here, you're seeing kind of this lack of conservation. Dennis the Menace is not understanding that. I mean, he's thinking that the more slices there are, the bigger the pizza will be. So he's gonna, he's hungrier. So cut it into more slices. Whereas somebody who has developed a sense of conservation would understand, well, okay, you can cut it into bigger slices and, still have the same amount of pizza. Next slide. This talks. This just is a fun thing with Calvin and Hobbes. Talking about the magical thinking, the animism that comes with preoperational thought. Although I'd like to think that Hobbes is real myself. Next slide. The Three Mountains task. Okay. And the next slide here has a video of the Three Mountains task, but I'll just kind of briefly go over it. Basically, it's the idea that children are unable to put themselves in the perspective of others. Children young in the preoperational stage are unable to take the perspective of other people. They will, if a person says, "What do you see?" The child will describe what they see. I see a mountain, I see a tree, a goat, whatever. And then the person says, "Well, what do I see?" "Well, I see a mountain, a tree, a goat," and they'll just repeat what they see, not necessarily what the other person sees. Children later in the preoperational stage and into the concrete operational stage will be able to take the perspective of the other person mentally and say, "Okay, you're seeing this, this, and this." And you'll see that in the video. Next slide. Examples of IQ tests. During this time, and you probably in your counseling practice will experience this if you work with children at all, is you'll see a lot of parents trying to gauge their child's intellectual functioning at this point in their life. Intelligence is still very fluid at this age, based more, and it will change largely throughout the remainder of childhood towards 8 to 10 years old, I would say, just based upon the experiences, the environment that the child is placed. So if you ever have an intelligence test given to a child and it's given, you see the report, take it with a grain of salt if it's at this age, because it's still a very variable experience-based construct. It's very fluid at this age. And these are just examples of different types of subtests that can be given to measure intelligence at this age. So the ambulance there, the child is asked to identify what's missing in this picture. Or the coding task there is saying, okay, if this symbol is present, what would the number be above? And it's kind of a processing speed test. The picture arrangement test is more of a measure of fluid intelligence, reasoning, being able to put things in organized pictorial perspective. Block design, you have various blocks with designs on them, and you have to, and you ask the child to make a picture that you show them out of the blocks. It's very much a perceptual reasoning task. They see something and they can reason with what they have to make those things that you show them. And then object assembly is also sort of a processing speed and visual processing test. Puzzles, basically. Those are just examples. There are a lot more, by the way. So what are the next slide, by the way? What are the critiques of Piaget's stages? What are the things that people are saying? Well, yes, Piaget could be right, but and this gives a good idea of what people are, what critiques have been levied against Piaget's theory. Things like children may not necessarily be as egocentric as he originally thought, or he may have overemphasized the cognitive skills of many adults in that perhaps his stages are off a little bit. Maybe children go through more of a concrete stage and don't necessarily make it to that formal operations stage later on in their development as much as Piaget thought they did. Also, for example, I'm not going to read every point here because they're pretty self-explanatory, but if you have questions on them, please let me know. Formal operations may not be the end. Your book actually in the later chapters talks about post-formal operations, and we'll talk about that at a later time, obviously, but there have been theories that there is something a little bit more than just formal operations. Next slide. So this is kind of an example of this. This child thought outside the box, and that's something you don't see a lot in pre-operational children. This child, they followed the directions. They colored the one that comes next. And and then they circled the quote correct answer. So this child was technically correct, but at the same time was technically incorrect. And it's this sort of outside of the box thinking that kind of brings Piaget's theory into question, because he would say that that children of this age don't have the ability to think outside of the box in such a way. So this is something to give consideration to as we kind of understand that Piaget's theory is just that, a theory. It's a way of understanding the world, a way of conceptualizing children, but at the same time it has room for growth still, right? That's a theory. Moving on to the next slide, we're getting into language development now. So there are several different types of theories of language development. One is a social learning theory, and this is very much sort of Bandura, the element of Bandura's theories. So children they witness or listen to other people talking, and they pick up what other people say. It's very receptive. It's very, they're saying circle as they point to this design, or red, or yellow, or birdie, something like that. And they pick up and make those associations over time. Reinforcement is very similar to that, saying that, oh, whenever I, say what they say, they clap their hands and they're excited, and if I say mama, I get mama to come over to me. If I say dada, dad comes over and gives me attention. Very reinforcement based. Another theory, though, it's more cognitive in nature. It's proposed by a researcher known as Noam Chomsky. he says that we are what's known as a, quote, language acquisition device, in that we are cognitively and biologically predisposed in our brains to pick up and process language and to be able to learn linguistically over time. And the explosion of language development that you see in the age 2 to 6 range is, he says, evidence of this. And then you have combined views that say, okay, sure, we could be biologically predisposed to language, but there's also, the idea that, reinforcement does come into play, or listening receptively does come into play. So it is possible that there could be a social and a biological and a psychological component in there, biopsychosocial. There you go. Next slide. So constructs in language include the most basic form of language, phonemes. Phonemes include things like t, k, m, ba, things like that. This forms the foundation for a lot of the babbling and gibberish that you hear babies evoking, expressing. Morphemes, on the other hand, they actually have meaning. Mama, dada, baba, something like that. Ma, ta, ti, things of that nature that could have some level of meaning, and that you can combine to form actual words. First words, typically, there are several different ways of conceptualizing first word development. You have receptive word ability, again, sort of a social learning aspect. You're taking in and then learning to make those similar sounds. Interestingly enough, an interesting little fact that you probably won't be tested on, don't worry, is that in the beginning of language development, children have the capacity to formulate and say all of the different types of sounds in every different language. They could learn the Inye of Spanish language, or more guttural sounds in Russian or Middle Eastern languages, or something of that nature. But that as they develop and as they grow in their culture, in their cultural language environment, they lose those abilities, actually, and have to reacquire them at a later age. And that's why it's so easy for children to learn second and third languages, but it's harder for adults to do so at later ages. Referential language, naming. This is doggy, this is Buster, or this is mama, daddy, papa, granny, things of that nature. And then expressive language, social functions. And this includes hollow phrases. Hollow phrases are one-word utterances. Hollow, one. They're one-word utterances. Cookie, doggy, baba, hot, cold. Certain phrases that could mean really anything. I'm hot, this is cold, mama come here, mama go away, bring me something. It could mean anything. Typically they're associated with gestures, pointing, reaching and grasping, things like that. Then you start getting into more of the telegraphic speech. Daddy there, daddy gone, me cookie, or want cookie, or me hot, something like that. And it gives a little bit more context to what they're saying, but at the same time it could, mean something, it could mean multiple things. And so the way that progresses then into, better communication is the development and learning of syntax and grammar. Syntax being the way words are put together, and then So instead of I run, it's I ran, or I goed, I went. And the semantics of words are more along the lines of we went to the store, or I am going to the store. It provides grammatical rules. And then you have social rules, and those are called pragmatics. Social rules, things like how you speak with your parents, for instance, versus how you speak with your buddy from down the street, versus how you speak to a boss. It's the social rules, the context in which we speak, that's referring to. Next slide. And this slide basically just goes over what we just talked about, the development of holophrastic and telegraphic speech, and then adult-like speech as it progresses into 5 to 6 years old. You don't have to worry about the stage 1, stage 2 grammar. I would know some about the difference between overgeneralizations, overregularization, things of that nature. Okay, your book kind of goes into that. The semantic relations, the next slide, talks about sort of the telegraphic speech. So, and the various different combinations that the child's words could suggest. So you could have an agent plus an action, baby cry. You could have the action and a location, jump stare. And so really the same thing could end up meaning having different various meanings. And that kind of shows the downside of telegraphic speech that eventually prompts the development of more semantic and more pragmatic speech. Next slide. And this, we've already kind of talked about each of these, from the phonology to the morphology. Those are the basic sounds, to the syntax and semantics, and that's, you know, the construction of words and the construction of sentences, to the pragmatics, to the cultural and the contextual basis of language. Next slide. And again, this is kind of a test for to see if how far a child has developed in their ability to formulate things linguistically. So would the child say there are 2 wugses, or would the child say there are 2 wugs? It depends on if the child has understood the syntax of the correct syntax of the word. Next slide. These last couple of slides, the last 4 slides here, kind of focus more on considerations, things to think about as you kind of move forward. So next slide, we'll talk about clinical applications. So things like how would a child react if parents are divorcing? You know, what would that do to their sense of autonomy? What would that do to their sense of shame and doubt? Would daycare be something to consider in order to continue developing those things? Healthy environments. Here's a question. If a parent comes in and brings a child to us, and it's clear that the parent is not providing a sound environment from which the child can learn a sense of autonomy, and in which they are developing a sense of shame and doubt, how should we approach that parent? You know, how should we say, you know, maybe you would like to take your child and go this direction with them? You know, how do we educate the parent in how to approach their child and help them develop a sense of autonomy? How do we help a parent understand their child, essentially? Next slide. Spiritual applications. What does it mean for somebody to have, you know, right, wrong, good, evil conceptualizations of how God looks at them? Even in adulthood, you know, somebody who is new to the faith, how do they see their relationship with God at this particular stage? Do they view themselves as all bad and all good? Do they see themselves as sinner or saint? This could be a source of great anxiety for many people who come to us. Something to think about. Next slide. And then the multicultural considerations here. Is Piaget's theory applicable to a Western culture or non-Western culture? Where did he kind of get his ideas? How did he experiment? How did he test his theory? Did he go to, someplace in Asia to test his theory, or Africa, or South America? No, he probably was more in the Eastern European, Western European, more American mindset. Again, similar question: are Erikson stages universal? Would somebody from a collectivistic culture have a sense of shame and doubt more than somebody from a Western culture, from a more individualistic culture? How does that impact one's sense of autonomy? So these are just considerations, and that finishes up the PowerPoint for this week. But those are just things to think about as you move forward and possibly see clients with and children going through these stages. So just to remind you guys that finishes up the lecture. This coming week, we're going to be having on February 4th the next Blackboard Collaborate session. I hope to see everybody there. If not, we'll have it recorded for your viewing pleasure. And I hope to see you all there. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to email me, give me a call, whatever. Please bring your thoughts about the discussion board posts, the lectures, questions to the Collaborate session. All right. Until then, everybody, I wish you a very good night and good studies.